with a wedge driven between them and science. And the intelligent design movement proposes to drive exactly that wedge, which is aimed to produce what they call a theistic science. If that happens, then something that all of us in this room have taken for granted during our lifetimes is going to change. And that something is that the United States is the worldwide leader in scientific research and technology. If we put that mantle down, and I think this movement has the potential to cause that to actually happen, a dozen nations around this world will eagerly pick it up, will take scientific leadership from us, and will never give it back. And that is what is at stake in Ohio and every one of the American states. Thank you very much for coming tonight.
Thank Professor Miller very much for his talk. He is open to questions. How much time, roughly?
You've got as much as more than half an hour.
Okay.
Whatever he wants to.
Fine.
We've got the webcast through 9 o'clock.
Okay, we'll figure that's probably a reasonable time. I'm going to moderate this, which means simply that I will point to people to stand up and ask questions. Patricia has suggested that I might contribute any comments that I would find helpful, but I will try to be very restrained in doing that. So who has questions? Yes.
Dr. Miller, how do you explain these, quote, legitimate scientists supporting this? I am embarrassed to confess that Dr. Behe is a biophysicist. I am as well. And I was shocked to see that he was doing this. I've known him for many years. How did they get into this, and what's going on, and what's their agenda?
Well, I'm not going to pretend for a minute to be able to psychoanalyze the people who stand on the other side of this debate. But I will point out that almost to a person, they regard evolution as the foundation of a dangerous scientific materialism. And I'm going to point to somebody who I think really summed up the reason for the opposition best. And I think this reason applies even to a trained scientist like Michael Behe or Jonathan Wells, who has 2 PhDs, or Stephen Meyer, who's trained in philosophy. This summer in August, I was listening to an interview on National Public Radio. And it was an interview with Senator Rick Santorum from Pennsylvania, who's just published a new book called It Takes a Family. And in there, it was like a 10-minute interview, and it was just to let him promote his book and say what it was about. But in the middle of it, the interviewer asked him, you know, Senator Santorum, I found it strange that in the middle of your book, you took a shot at part of the science curriculum. Now, you're a senator, a politician, with no training in science. But nonetheless, you decided to take a shot at evolution. And then he said, why evolution? And it's almost an exact quote that I almost have it memorized. And Senator Santorum says, because it really matters. It's where we come from. And he said, if we're just an accident, if we're a mistake of nature, then that puts a different moral demand on us. And he thought for a second and said, in fact, it doesn't put a moral demand on us. Then if we are the intentional creation of a supreme being who does make moral demands. Now think about that. Because what he said is that if evolution is right, morality is an illusion. And morality isn't just don't do sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Morality is what's right in the world. How do you treat the poor? Issues of war and peace, economic justice, fairness, personal integrity. Morality matters, and I think it matters to all of us. It certainly matters to me. If you actually come to believe that evolution as a doctrine invalidates any sense of morality, you're going to oppose it, whether you think it's scientifically justified or not. Now, I'm not going to pretend to look inside Dr. Behe's head and see if that's exactly what is making him tick. But I do know he has said very clearly that he thinks evolution and evolutionary materialism is a morally destructive doctrine. And I would assume that's the source of the motivation.
Next question.
Got one up on the balcony.
Okay, up there.
Listen loud.
You'll have to talk loudly.
Sure. These folks wouldn't participate through the political process instead of the scientific process, unless that's where the fertile ground was. I've spent a lot of time on the political left and noticed that hostility towards science is just as great there. The New Age stuff you were talking about, astrology, etc.
You betcha,
so
yeah.
What is it that we ought to be doing better?
Well, that's a really good question, and I also, as an ex-Barry Goldwater Republican, I appreciate you saying that large elements of the left are anti-science, and it certainly is true. And you see this, for example, I think you see this most clearly in the European left, where the European left has been enormously hostile to science and technology. I think, and I'll accuse myself first, I think that we in science suck at getting our message across to the public. We are terrible popularizers. And as an example of that, I would ask how many people in the audience were aware of the discovery regarding the fusion of human chromosome number 2, which was worked out about 18 months ago. Yeah, exactly. A couple well-informed biologists. But aside from that, that should have been popularized. That should have been on the evening news, and there should have been sort of the Carl Sagan types writing about it and talking about it. And part of it is because, quite frankly, we in science, we have the best jobs in the world. I mean, how cool it is to be able to walk in your laboratory in the morning and say, gee, I wonder what I shall try to discover today. And you know what? That's the job that I have, and a lot of other people in this room have too, and that's cool. So why would you want to get messed up in the political process if that was it? So that's one reason, is self-absorption. Another reason, I think, is a terrible and ultimately self-destructive tendency in the scientific community to look down our noses at popularizers. Example, Carl Sagan, who I think was the most effective popularizer of science in the last 30 or 40 years, in many circles was looked down upon by his colleagues in the astronomical and physical science community. Stephen Jay Gould, the great evolutionary biologist, this may come as news to some of you who don't know this field very tightly, but Steve was actually looked down upon by many people who regarded themselves as more serious evolutionary scientists, precisely because Steve wrote for the general public and did that brilliantly. Until we in the scientific community, A, do a better job of popularizing science, and B, begin to reward our best messengers to the public sphere, I think science is going to take heat from both the left and the right.
And in front here? Okay, further back in the center there.
Speaking from the left, I want to just suggest a slightly different take on all of this.
Sure.
I think that when you said that what's at stake here is everything, you actually gave a very narrow definition of everything, because you only talked about science and technology.
That's true. I agree.
And I
I'll
think
take
what's
that.
at stake here, and many people on the left think that what's at stake here is literally everything. It's not just theocratic science, but it's theocracy in government. It's many issues that are defined as moral issues by this or that, different religious group, and it's being pushed by the most restrictive religious perspective, and not the broadest religious perspective about what morality and what ethics is, and what politics is, and what democracy is, and what the political structure should be. So I think it really is about everything in a much broader sense. And I'll just finish by saying that you asked about theocratic science. I've seen theocratic science. When I was teaching at Rutgers, I had a student who was from Pakistan, and she provided me a lot of articles in English about Muslim science, and how the goal of Muslim science should be to, they actually didn't talk so much about God, but they talked about principles of good and bad that could be discovered and dealt with, and they were talking about good and evil as the subject matter of science.
No, I think that's a worthwhile point. It's interesting that you brought up Muslim science. About 3 or 4 years ago, I started, because I have a little web page with a lot of evolution stuff up on it. I started to get emails from Turkey and Lebanon and even a couple from Iran, believe it or not, of students who wanted me to answer their questions about evolution. And a few of them I asked, why are you asking me this? And they connected me with the writings that go under the pen name of Harun Yaha, who is an Islamic writer based in Turkey, who has written a whole series of anti-evolution books. And one of the students was actually kind enough to buy